Inside the British Library, shielded by a glass case, sits a small, rusted piece of metal that holds a secret about the very nature of human perception. It is a tuning fork that once belonged to Ludwig van Beethoven. When struck, this fork vibrates at exactly 455.4 hertz. It is a specific, piercing frequency that no orchestra on this planet uses today. Not 440, not 432. It is a relic of a sound that the modern world has collectively, and quite literally, abandoned. Every piano in every concert hall, every digital track on your phone, and every broadcast on the airwaves is tuned to a global standard that Beethoven never used. To his ears, the music we call perfect today would have sounded flat, alien, and fundamentally wrong. This raises a disturbing question. If the greatest musical mind in history operated on a completely different acoustic plane, why did we change the locks on the doors of sound? The frequency we inherited was not discovered in nature. It was legislated into existence. And to make room for this new standard, everything that came before it, the specific vibrations that defined human communities for 1,000 years, had to be systematically erased from the physical world. We aren't just talking about a change in musical taste, we are talking about the physical destruction of the instruments that held these frequencies. If you have ever wondered why ancient cathedrals feel like they are humming with a power you can to quite name, you are touching the hem of a lost science. Across 3 centuries, governments didn't just target people or land, they targeted bronze. They targeted the million bells that served as the acoustic heartbeat of Europe and Russia. But they didn't just want the metal for cannons. There was something else carried within that bronze, a specific pitch tuned by families of founders whose knowledge was passed from father to son across generations. That sound is gone now, and as we peel back the layers of this great frequency reset, we find that the story of how that sound disappeared is far more deliberate than any history book wants to admit. Before 1711, there was no such thing as a standard pitch. There were no electronic references, no international treaties, and no tuning forks. If you lived in a village in the Alps, your world vibrated to the frequency of your local church bell. If you traveled to a cathedral in Vienna, the air itself felt different because the organ was tuned to the resonance of that specific stone. This wasn't chaos, it was a natural state of acoustic ecology. Every community had its own unique voice, a frequency matched to the very materials of the buildings they inhabited. But then, the governments got involved. They realized that sound, much like currency or language, could be centralized. They began to pass laws, not suggestions, but legal statutes, dictating the vibration rate of a musical note. But why would a nation emerging from revolution find the time to legislate the frequency of an A above middle C? Why would a military institution, rather than a conservatory, be the one to sign the decree? The answer lies in a hidden relationship between sound and the human body, a relationship that certain researchers are only now beginning to prove in controlled, peer-reviewed studies. There's a physiological cost to being out of tune with your environment. And while we were told the new standard was for efficiency, the trail of what was physically melted down suggests a much darker motive. To understand what we lost, we have to look at what happened when the bells were silenced and the stone was left to ring alone. Before the invention of the tuning fork in 1711, the world didn't hum to a single beat. It was a polyphonic landscape where every city, every valley, and every cathedral had its own unique acoustic fingerprint. If you were a musician traveling from Paris to Venice in the year 1700, you didn't just carry your instrument, you carried the necessity of a total recalibration. There was no international standard. There was no correct pitch. Instead, there was a deep, local resonance anchored to the largest physical object in the community, the church organ or the great bells in the tower. We have the physical proof of this wild variation sitting in museum archives today. A tuning fork associated with George Frederick Handel from 1740 vibrates at 422.5 hertz. An unidentified specimen from 1780 sits much lower at 409. Meanwhile, Beethoven's fork from 1800 hits that sharp, high 455.4. That is a massive span of 46 hertz across just 60 years. These weren't amateur mistakes. These were the leading edge of European culture. This lack of a standard wasn't a failure of technology. It was a success of architecture. Every building is made of materials, limestone, oak, marble, that have their own natural resonant frequency. Medieval builders understood that a space sings best when the sound matches the stone. When the bells rang at a pitch specific to their village and the choir tuned to those bells and the congregation sang with the choir, the entire environment entered into a state of sympathetic resonance. The building itself became an amplifier for the human spirit, but this local autonomy posed a problem for a world moving toward centralization. As the 19th century dawned, governments began to realize that if you control the frequency, you control the atmosphere of the room. They didn't want 1,000 different voices, they wanted one. They wanted a sound that could be broadcast, recorded, and regulated across entire empires. In 1859, The French government did something unprecedented. They moved music from the conservatory to the courtroom. They passed a law declaring that the note A would vibrate at exactly 435 hertz, the diapason normal. It was the first time in history that a government dictated the vibration of the air by legal statute. But the French were just the beginning. As this movement towards standard pitch spread across Europe, a strange and powerful voice rose in opposition. Giuseppe Verdi, perhaps the most famous composer alive, pleaded with the Italian government to consider a different number. He wasn't looking for convenience. He was looking for what he called mathematical exigencies. He wanted 432 hertz, a frequency that many modern researchers believe aligns with the mathematical structure of the biological world. Italy listened. For one brief year in 1884, the Italian War Ministry officially adopted Verdi's 432 hertz. But then, in 1885, at a conference in Vienna, something happened. A group of delegates, not musicians, but bureaucrats and British representatives, overruled the Italians. They killed the 432 standard after only 12 months. Why was the British delegation so insistent on crushing a frequency that Verdi claimed was superior for the human voice? And why, just as these standards were being debated, did governments across Europe suddenly decide that hundreds of thousands of ancient church bells, the literal tuning forks of the people, had to be taken down and melted into liquid? Why was the British delegation so insistent on crushing a frequency that Verdi claimed was superior for the human voice? The answer might be found not in the concert hall, but in the foundry. Just as these international standards were being debated, a physical war was being waged against the very instruments that held the old frequencies. Across 3 centuries, a staggering number of church bells, the literal tuning forks of the people, were taken down and melted into liquid. This wasn't just about the metal. We are told that during times of war, governments simply needed bronze for cannons and coins. But look at the sheer scale of the elimination. In 1700, Peter the Great confiscated approximately 100,000 church bells across Russia. In 1793, during the French Revolution, a decree was passed. Each parish could keep exactly 1 bell. Every other bell in France was to be melted. In less than 2 years, 100,000 bells from 60,000 steeples vanished. 80% of the nation's acoustic heritage was erased. Then came the 20th century. The Soviet government, under Decree LO8 in 1929, forbade all bell ringing and ordered every bell in the nation melted for industrial use. 99% of Russia's approximately 1 million bells were destroyed. 20 specialized bell foundries, which held the hereditary secrets of how to tune bronze to the specific resonance of stone, were closed forever. When the Soviet Union collapsed decades later and craftsmen tried to revive the art, they couldn't. The knowledge was gone. The ear for the old world had been physically executed. Add the numbers from the World Wars. The Nazis confiscated over 175,000 bells across occupied Europe. Belgium lost 2/3 of its bells. In the Netherlands, investigators reported that every single bell had been removed. By the time the dust settled, at least 425,000 documented precision acoustic instruments had been physically eliminated from the European landscape. When the bells melted, the frequencies melted with them. Every replacement bell, every new organ, and every instrument cast after this destruction was tuned to whatever standard the current government endorsed, usually the 440 hertz we use today. The old pitches could not survive because their reference points had been turned into munitions and machinery. I went into this research expecting to find a coordinated conspiracy, a single room of men deciding to change the frequency of the human mind. But what I found is actually more unsettling. The French Revolution melted bells for liberty. The Soviets melted them for industry. The Nazis melted them for conquest. 3 different centuries, 3 different ideologies, but the exact same result. Every old frequency reference in Europe was physically eliminated. When the same outcome emerges from unrelated causes over 300 years, you aren't looking at a plan. You're looking at a pattern that reproduces itself whenever power is centralized. But there is a missing piece to this puzzle. If the bells were the voice, the great cathedrals were the body. And while the bells were being turned into cannons, the buildings they were designed for were still standing. Ancient architects didn't just build for aesthetics, they built for resonance. They embedded clay pots and acoustic vases into the very domes of their churches to amplify specific wavelengths. They chose limestone not just for its strength, but for its crystalline properties that conduct sound. So, what happens when you remove the voice from a body that was specifically engineered to amplify it? What happens to a building when the frequency it was designed to hum with is replaced by something alien? The answer is buried in the walls of 800-year-old churches, where modern researchers have discovered a technology we are only now beginning to understand, and it is a technology that is currently off. We have the voice, the bells, and we have the body, the cathedral. But for centuries, we've been told the architecture was purely for the glory of God or the ego of kings. Modern science is beginning to tell a much more technical story. In 2016, researchers from Greek universities used sine wave sweeps to map the acoustic properties of 8 Byzantine churches in Thessaloniki. They didn't find just good echoes. They found that the architects had made deliberate, high-tech design choices based entirely on sound. Hidden within the very domes and walls of these structures were acoustic vases, clay pots called amphorae, physically embedded into the masonry. These weren't decorations, they were Helmholtz resonators. They were hollow cavities designed to capture, filter, and amplify specific resonant frequencies. If the priest spoke or the choir sang at the correct pitch, these vases would catch the vibration and throw it back into the room with supernatural clarity. At Noyon Cathedral in France, researchers discovered something even more advanced, an underground chamber called the cavo phono. It was a monumental array of acoustic vases installed beneath the floor of the crossing, inspired by the architectural treatises of Vitruvius from the 1st century before Christ. The building wasn't just a house of worship, it was a massive stone and glass amplifier. Medieval builders selected limestone and crystalline stones, specifically because those materials conduct and amplify sound waves with minimal loss. Gothic cathedrals were engineered to produce reverberation times of 5 to 8 seconds. One acoustics researcher, studying this ancient architecture, made an observation that should stop you cold. He wrote that these churches were much better at holding sound than holding people. He wondered if the buildings were actually constructed for the sound itself, that the painted saints and the reverberant frequencies were the true occupants, and the humans were just the witnesses. You have felt this. Every tourist who walks into a great cathedral describes a hum beneath their awareness, a sense that the stone itself is resonating. We call it sacred, but the physics says it is acoustic. For 500 years, the entire building hummed in a unified resonance, stone amplifying bronze, bronze amplifying voice, voice amplifying stone. It was a perfect feedback loop calibrated to the molecular properties of the limestone. But then the loop was broken. The bells were melted into cannons. The organs were retuned to the new French or British standards. The choir followed the organ. Today, the only element still vibrating at the original frequency is the building itself. The vases are still in the walls. The stone still favors the same wavelengths, but nothing is feeding it the key to turn it on. The instrument is perfectly intact, but nobody is playing it. Modern churches are dead by comparison. We use drywall, carpet, and foam to kill the very resonance the ancients died to protect. We use microphones to compensate for the fact that our buildings no longer speak. But if frequency is just a number, why does it matter? Why did a group of volunteers in a published, peer-reviewed study show a measurable change in their heart rates when the music shifted by just 8 hertz? If a tiny shift in pitch can change your biology, what happened to the human psyche when we disconnected ourselves from the stone instruments that held us for a millennium? We are told that 440 hertz is the correct standard for a modern globalized world. But as we look at the biological data, we have to ask, was this standard chosen for our harmony, or was it chosen because of what it does to our focus? There is a reason the world sounds wrong today, and it's not just in your head, it's in your heartbeat. Next step. Would you like me to move to segment 5, the physiological impact of frequency, where we look at the heart rate studies and the suspicious rise of the 1936 radio broadcast reference tone? If a tiny shift in pitch can change your biology, why did we settle on a frequency that many claim feels wrong? For years, the internet has been obsessed with the 432 versus 440 hertz debate. Most of it is dismissed as pseudoscience, but when you look at actual peer-reviewed data, the skepticism begins to crumble. In a published study, 33 volunteers were exposed to music at both 432 and 440 hertz without knowing which was which. The results were measurable and objective. The group, listening to 432 hertz, showed a statistically significant decrease in heart rate. They reported feeling more focused, more satisfied, and less physically stressed. Think about the implications of that 8 hertz shift. If a single song can change your heart rate, what happens when an entire civilization lives inside buildings calibrated to a specific pitch for 500 years? What happens when every bell in every tower is tuned to a frequency that matches the biological resonance of the human body? For centuries, humanity lived in an acoustic womb, a world where the architecture and the audio were in perfect harmony with our own nervous systems. But in 1936, the United States Bureau of Standards did something that effectively killed the local heartbeat of every town in America. They began transmitting a 440 hertz reference tone every hour from radio station WWV. Musicians across the country, from high school bands to professional orchestras, began tuning their instruments to the radio. The local frequency died. The national one took its place. This wasn't a choice made by artists. It was a technological broadcast that overrode the ears of the people. One pitch for every instrument, every recording, and every broadcast, everywhere on the planet, all at once. We moved from 1,000 organic local frequencies to a single synthetic global standard. I'm not arguing that 440 hertz is a weapon of mind control. I am arguing that the shift was the largest acoustic transformation in human history. And it happened in the same centuries that saw the physical destruction of every old reference instrument in Europe. The bells are silent, the founders are gone. The buildings that were designed to hold the old sound still stand, resonating with frequencies that no instrument feeds them anymore. The stone remembers what the world chose to forget. But as we look at these empty stone amplifiers, we have to ask, if they weren't just for praying, what were they actually doing? What happened inside that resonance that we no longer experience? What was the physical effect on a human being who stood at the center of a cathedral when the stone, the bronze, and the voice were all vibrating as one? We have the architecture, we have the acoustic vases, we have the proof of engineering. What we do not have is the key. But there is one final haunting realization. We think the old world is dead because the people who lived in it are gone. But the buildings are still here. They are waiting. And if you know where to look, you can find the places where the resonance hasn't quite faded, where the great frequency reset missed a spot. We are living in an era of acoustic amnesia. We walk through massive stone cathedrals and marvel at their beauty, never realizing we're standing inside a decommissioned machine. The acoustic vases embedded in 800-year-old walls are still there. The reverberation times measured by university researchers are still active. The crystalline limestone still waits to conduct the next wave. The only thing missing is the frequency that melted with the bronze. Nobody is asking what it truly sounded like because the people who remembered are as gone as the bells themselves. We have been given a world of standardized digital perfection, a world where every A is exactly 440 hertz, and in exchange, we gave up the local harmony that connected us to our soil and our history. The next time you stand in an old building and feel that inexplicable hum, don't just call it a feeling. Recognize it as the resonance of a lost technology. The stone remembers. It is waiting for a sound that hasn't been heard for 300 years. The question isn't which frequency is right. The question is what kind of people we would be if we were allowed to live inside the resonance once again. The bells may be cannons now, and the cannons may be coins, but the architecture of sound remains. The archives are open. The stone is waiting. And somewhere, in the vibration of an old tuning fork, the key is still waiting to be turned.